Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Fisher. I'm an applications engineer with Printastat, and you are watching Uncle Fish's CAD Tricks and Tips. What we're looking at today is Field to Finish, Part 2. We're looking at label styles. Just to reiterate, one of the things that we're trying to do here is establish what our Field to Finish process is all about. That is the process when you bring the points in from your data collector, dump them into Civil 3D, and hopefully get some automation to happen so that you don't have to play dot to dot and do everything individually. It is much quicker and much faster the more you can get automated. And hopefully, if you stick with me through this series of videos, we can get to about 80% of automation. That's pretty good. I tend to think of the points being into three different categories based on what their needs are. Okay? I tend to think of the first kind of category as an object point. These are things like fire hydrants, gas caps, manholes, individual elements that are going to come up as a symbology, utility poles, guy lines, all of those kind of things that are going to be represented by a symbol on our plan. Next thing is in line work. We'll get to that in another couple of videos. And last but not least is points that make up a surface. We'll get to know those in another couple of videos. For today, what we've looked at so far is in my first video, I showed you how to do the symbology and to create point styles based on that symbology. Today, what we're going to look at is how to create a point style. This is a little bit more in depth and takes a little bit more practice to get good at. So let's take a look at what we have. So this is a drawing I have, very, very simple, very, very basic. I have 10 blocks. I have just a single layer. And what I'm looking at over here in my settings tab is I already have a bunch of point styles created. So let's actually create a point so we can start to figure out what is actually happening here and how to use these. So I go to points, create manual. I'm going to put it somewhere in space here. Let's just call this benchmark. And let's put it at an elevation of 150.00. Enter. Doesn't look like we did anything. It certainly doesn't look like much, but let's take a look at how we can start to utilize this. So if I click on that object, it has properties just like everything else. And if I change my default style, or from the default style to the benchmark style, you'll see that voila, now I have a symbol. Now I need to add some kind of a label to go with that. Now is where the point label style comes into play. So I'll change that to my standard style. And let's take a look at what that standard style actually is and actually looks like. So go into my label styles, standard, right click, go into edit. And let's kind of break this out a little bit. On the information tab, that's just the name. The general tab, this is where you think of everything as kind of a collective unit. Nothing is really broken out or broken into pieces yet. Over here on the layout tab is where things start to get a little bit different. First thing you'll notice is that we have different components going on here. We have the point number, the elevation, and description as components. So let me go down to elevation, or I'm sorry, go back up to point number, and let me come down here to change a setting or two so that you can see what you're actually looking at. So if I look at my point elevation and I change this to be true, now what you can see is that I actually have three separate components based on what the object is. So I'm going to show you next is kind of how they get organized. So, for example, if we take a look at our point number, what you're going to see is that it's got a name. It's got a visibility component. Let's turn that off just to see what happens. Okay, obviously that's going to go away, but the other ones stay. It's got an anchor component. Well, let's come back and take a look at that here in a second. and then it's got an anchor point of top left. So let's take a look at the elevation, and let's take a look at what changes. What you can see here is that our anchor component actually changed. That means that this label, the elevation value, that 200 value, is anchored at the middle right of the point. So if you can imagine a little box being drawn around that X, at each point on the box and at each corner, that's going to be one of the anchor components, or excuse me, one of the anchor points. Obviously, if we make a change, you can kind of see what's going to happen there. Change that to be bottom center, just so you can get the idea. Again, if you can imagine that little box, it's going to be on the bottom center based on that elevation. I want to make that in my middle right, just so that we have something that looks fairly normal. And now let's go back and consider what we have going on here. We have that point number locked to the point elevation. The point elevation is going to have a top left component. And down here, this point number is going to have a bottom left attachment point. So let's change that to bottom right just to see what happens. So there you go. You can kind of see, like, you can actually see the little box there. So imagine this being the corner here and this being the corner here. So that's what the standard style sort of looks like. Let's change that back to be, let's try top left. Definitely not. Let's try bottom left. That's what we want to see. We want them to be a little bit stacked. I'm going to leave that as it is just so that we can have something kind of as a reference here. And now I'm going to start to build my own. And this is where I'm going to think about what my object or what my point is actually going to represent. Instead of going through and creating 10 different label styles for all of these different objects, I'm just going to try to do this with one. And I'm going to modify or create a new style a little bit, just so you can kind of get a grasp of how that's going to work. So I'm going to go to my label styles, click on new. I'm sorry, right click on new. We'll just call this my fish style. Take a look at my general. And again, this tab is sort of what you got to think of as kind of the collective unit of the point and the object or the descriptions. Now is where I'm going to change my thought process a little bit, and I'm going to come over here to layout. I'm going to use my elevation as kind of my main value here. I'm going to get rid of my point number. So I'm going to just hit that little X, and I'm going to get rid of my description, so that now instead of having pieces that are separated, what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat all three of those as the same. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come down here to contents. I'm going to click on my three little buttons. And now I'm going to add in, all right, so there's my elevation. I'm going to put my cursor on the top left there. Hit the enter key so it gives me a space. And now I'm going to add in my point number up at the top. And the way to do that is to hit this little arrow. So now I have the point number on top, point elevation second. Let's just take a look at that in what we have. And if you can imagine a square being drawn, a rectangle being drawn around those two components together, let's actually add that in there. Now you can see that I have that middle left point here associated with the middle right point here. So there's my middle left, there's my middle right. So let's go in and add our third piece back in here to my pieces of text. I'm going to hit the enter key so I can come down below my point elevation. And this time I'm going to add in my raw description. And you can see that there's a lot of other options that we could do here. But I'm going to add in my raw description. Click on OK. All of these little things over here are basically the computer coding for how this is all going to look. And it's all of those different settings that you see. So I'm going to leave the square on there. Actually, yeah, I'm going to leave that rectangular label or border on there just so that we can start to play with this a little bit and understand this. So now, if I go back to my object, I have two different styles to work with. I have my raw description. Oh, excuse me. I have my actual point style. And now I have that label style. So let's change that to fish. And you can see what happens there. Now I have all of those objects collected together. And if I wanted to make them, different colors or different things like that, I can certainly do that. My preference is to leave them all together so that if I move this object to a layer, for example, if I come up here and I create a new layer, let's call this benchmark. We'll open this guy up. Whoops. Open this guy up here. Change that to be, let's do yellow since it's easy to see. Close my layers. If I can get back to the right button here. There we go. And now if I flip this, I can go to my layer and I could say benchmark. And now all of those objects are on the same color, or they have the same color. When you have 75 different layers that are available and you are working with different objects and different colors, this is a very, very quick and easy way to separate things that are on an object versus things that are in something that is linear. So for example, I could go over here and I could create a new label style. And let's just work with the hydrant on this one. So let's call this hydrant. I'll go over to my general tab. I'm fine with all that. I'm just going to change my readability to 91 degrees. I'm going to go through that same process. I'm going to eliminate my point number and my description and add them back in so that everything functions together. So that's going to be my point number. Hit my little arrow. Come down here, hit my description, hit my arrow. Now let's just say, for example, I know that anything that is going to be a hydrant, let's make that come up as something much more visible. So let's make that red. I click on apply and OK. Let's go in and put another point in here. Create points, manual, do a point down here. Let's call this hydrant. It's not our field code. This is just an example of how to manage the labels. And let's put this at, let's say 199.99. And now let's change the actual properties. So let's say this is going to be my hydrant. Now let's call this my hydrant style. All right, just to give you an example of how these label styles work, here is an example file. You can see that obviously all of my symbology is on the correct layers that I want them to be. For example, that is on the VBench layer, etc. That's on a bollard layer. It's on a light or the electric utilities layer. And let's take a look at all of these. What you'll see is that the point style, of course, is varied and the point label style is varied. However, if I unselect my diagonal purple one, you can see that all of these styles are object-based, meaning that it is much easier to see and grasp what all of those objects are actually on. This purple style is on something or has something called a point label style called surface. That means that if I have 2,000 points on my screen and I'm trying to scan around and figure out what ground shots we have, this is a really quick and easy way for me to pull that out visually and figure out what is what. All right. I am Uncle Fish, and thanks for watching. We will see you next time.